you say, is beaming in from Seattle.
Hello, Nigel. Good morning.
Hello, Chris. Good to see you there in Seattle. It's the morning there in Seattle, I believe.
Yep.
It's 6 p.m. here in the UK. You're in Seattle. I'm in Leicester, which has strong associations with one of the two people you're going to talk about tonight, Tony Locke. I have fond childhood memories of him kissing and hugging every Leicestershire player when he revitalised us in the 1960s. None of them wanted to be kissed or hugged, but they couldn't get out of it.
Couldn't avoid it.
It was compulsory. Chris, I'm not going to say a lot by way of introduction because you're well known to our members, not least through your writings for the journal. You contribute to also, I think, all the journals while I was editor, and that's continued, and it's great because often that's sort of a version of part of one of your books. And you've written about Locke and Laker already. That's the subject of the session today. Laker and Locke. I'm holding up the book. I hope a lot of our viewers have got copies. It's really great to have a talk from you to us here. I know you're coming to England in June, I think it is, and if I've got it right, you're also going to talk about Laker and Locke in the long room at the Oval on Sunday, the 25th of June, after a day's championship play. There, I've got that right, have I?
Yes, that's correct. It's I think it's Surrey, Lancashire, the first day's play, and decompress, if that's the right word, by coming to the long room at the end of play, and I'll try and entertain the whoever. So
I'm sure we've got some Surrey members beaming in. So that's a special message to anybody really, but to them and their guests. Treat somebody to a day at the cricket, or at least the after cricket in the long room. Chris, you've written a lot of books. I counted up on the inside page of the latest 28 previous books. Quite a few of them are about cricket, and of course most of our viewers will associate you with that, but you've also written a lot of other biographies, including music biographies: Paul McCartney, Rolling Stones, the Boss, Bruce Springsteen, and Mick Jagger, who's actually mentioned in the book that we're looking at tonight. So you've got a big backlist there. You were joint winner of our Book of the Year in 2020 with your book about the cricketers of 1939, and you'd had the cricketers of 1915 before them. So without more ado, I'm going to prompt one or two question areas. I think you wanted to start with 1956. I imagine some of our viewers might, looking around, one or two of them might even have been watching cricket in 1956. I know we have a number of members who are actually at the Old Trafford Test in 1956. So particularly if there's anyone there, do use the chat room to let us know that, but also to pose any questions that you would like put to you later on. We're going to finish at 7 o'clock prompt in the interests of everyone. 1956. So where can we start with 1956?
Well, yeah, what a month. I mean, July of 56. It was quite turbulent in the UK. I mean, it was the beginning of what became the Suez Crisis and other sort of events like that. But, you know, the real drama, of course, was at Old Trafford. And I do remember my mate and biography subject, Godfrey Evans, bless him, talking about the sort of Laker-Locke partnership at that particular match. And what was most striking was, as the more wickets Laker took, and of course we all know he ended up with 19, but the more wickets he took, the more incensed Locke got at the other end. And there's some quite funny photographs, I think one's in the book, of the sort of 15th or 16th wicket that Jim Laker took. And you can see a look of absolute disdain on Locke's face in the slips or leg slip. He's standing there with his arms across his chest, scowling as the Aussie batsman departs. And I think his pleasure sort of, his pleasure at the early wickets evaporated quite rapidly. And Godfrey said that it was almost as though Tony Lott was sort of propelled by demons almost. He propelled literally, because he bowled faster and faster as the match went on, and he was coming in at brisk medium pace by the end, and steam rising off him. And as his friend and rival got more and more wickets, and God has said to him, for God's sakes, just slow down and let the wicket do the work. And I won't use the intensifier here. There's a family show, I know, that Tony used, but it was to the effect of, get lost. You can adapt that in any, but it was blunt and it was negative. And he just couldn't sort of adapt to the circumstance. He couldn't adapt to the situation. The only thing I think was going on in Tony's mind was, this bugger's getting all the wickets and I want some. And he just sped up and sped up and sped up. And Godfrey said, I kept to Frank Tyson, I kept to Truman, I kept to say, and Lott was one of the fastest bowlers.
You keep telling me that, but
Hello, we still on?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. He kept, and Godfrey said that Lott, in that sort of frame of mind, Lott was about the fastest bowler he ever encountered, and he had to soak his hands, I remember, in cold water that night. So there was a case of maybe Laker being a more intelligent bowler in the sense of keeping his composure and adapting to the circumstances. And Tony was always motivated by this hyper competitive, but sometimes it was not in the best interest of either himself or the team. I'll do a quick, if I may, I won't sit here and read my word, but a quick page, if I may, on that test, just to sort of set the scene of, because, obviously it's the most storied test match, possibly, some people would say, of all time, but certainly of that era. But this is July '56, Old Trafford. The last rites played out before a small but appreciative crowd of about 4,000. And incidentally, it's one of those matches where many more than 4,000 people will tell you they were there. But there's evidence that it was quite a small last day crowd. At the death, there was a muted appeal and a slight pause. The black-hatted umpire, Emrys Davies, came out of his crouch, his long white coat flapping at his ankles, and stabbed his left index finger towards the batsman. At that, Jim Laker simply turned, took his sweater from Davies, slung it over his shoulder, and trudged off, his face set, looking for all the world as if he was returning from a general session in the nets. Far from being a fire-breathing agent of the Australians' doomed, he seemed quiet and faintly embarrassed by all the fuss being made of him. A few teammates offered a handshake, and Godfrey Evans went so far as a genial pat on the back. There was no visible sense of communal or individual elation beyond that. Laker treated himself to a glass of his sponsor's Lucozade and a cigarette in the dressing room, and one or two of the opposition players wandered in to offer their compliments. Well done, Jimmy, you've done a great job, Neil Harvey informed him. Well, you've got to get him when you can, haven't you? Laker shrugged. And that was pretty much it. There was a famous story, and it seems to have been true, that Jim then got in his Austin Minor and drove all the way back to London by himself, stopping on the way for a pint and a sandwich at a pub probably in Staffordshire somewhere, where they watched the black and white footage of the day. And of course, no one recognized him. He just sat there at the bar while everyone watched this wonderful 19-wicket performance, completely unmobbed or unrecognized, got home in the middle of the night. And by a strange quirk of the fixture gods, at 11 the very next morning, Surrey were playing the Aussies. So I'm sure they were heartily sick of the sight of him by then. So he had 3 or 4 hours in bed, I think, and then he got up. His daughter was not well, and he probably had a very short night's sleep, and went straight back to the Oval, where probably to his relief it was raining. So they didn't get on immediately. But I mean, what are the odds of playing the Australians in that atmosphere at Old Trafford, driving all the way back home by himself, and then facing them again the next morning? Incredible. So he got a lot of wickets that summer against the Aussies. Between it's sometimes forgotten that he took all 10 for Surrey, and they played them twice that summer at the Oval. And he got all 10 in May as well in a match against the Australians. So I'm sure they were heartily sick of him by then. But I mean, you know, Locke's reaction is priceless, I always think. He was the ultimate team man, but he was also always in it for Tony Locke. And the idea that someone else was getting these wickets was not good. And Laker said they didn't talk for 6 months after that. Whether that's entirely literally true, I don't know. They did go to South Africa on a boat with the MCC only a couple of months later. It seems unlikely that they would literally not have spoken. But that was always Lakers. He said he would not say a word to me till the following season. So, yeah, be that as it may. They were colleagues, not friends, I think it'd be fair. They were teammates, probably respected each other, but they were not close friends. And that came through loud and clear in all the research. So anyway, July of '56, I think any book on them has to start there and you know, work outwards from that.
And yours does. Of course, in 1956, Jim Laker was already 34. I checked that earlier because you tend to think of him being perhaps a bit younger. He was 7 years older than Tony Locke. So there's a lot of backstory before 1956, even though it's 1956 that we tend to think of with Laker and Locke. Shall we go right to the beginning, to their respective childhoods? I know that that's something that you write quite a bit about in the book, because that's very interesting. Their backgrounds. They were both brought up in single parent families. I think there were some similarities, but a lot of differences. But it's interesting how they started and how that shaped their characters for later on.
Yes, so it was slightly unconventional in both cases. Jim's father basically abandoned them when he was a youngster, and he was brought up, as you say, by his mum, and I think there were 4 sisters, and they had a fiction whereby some of the sisters were meant to be his aunts, the older ones, and the younger ones who were nearer his age were his sisters, and it was all a very strange sort of relationship, and you know, it was not quite as accepted in those days to have a single parent family as it might be now. So they had to come up with this sort of story. And I'm sure it left, I'm not a psychologist, and I try not to get into the briar patch of you know, trying to analyze people's minds, but you could see how that would leave an impression on a young man's mind. And he was certainly very close to his mum, and she was a great encourager, and she was the one out there in the back garden with the tennis ball and the bucket to practice all afternoon. And I think she played the role of the mother and the father, sort of, in his growing up. And Tony Locke's case was slightly different in that his father was sports mad and had ambitions at one time to play county cricket, but didn't. And he grew up around Limpsfield in Surrey, so he was a Surrey lad. I might add that Laker, of course, was in the Bradford area. And the whole idea of how he ended up playing for Surrey, not Yorkshire, is a slightly strange one in itself. I mean, you know, he escaped the net somehow. He should have played for Yorkshire. But Tony was brought up in Surrey, and his mother unfortunately died of cancer when he was a young man. So he was sort of brought up by his dad, and his father was cricket mad, highly competitive. And we just touched on Tony's sort of competitive streak, and you can see that when he's a youngster. Before his mother died, there was a family tennis match, I'm reliably told, and sort of a tournament, a Locke family tournament, and it ended up the final of this match. I'm not sure how well structured it was, but the final of the tournament was Tony against his mother, and in between games or sets, his father would sort of sidle up to the young 8-9-year-old Tony and say, you know, your mother's got a weak backhand, so you know, you want to exploit that. You want to. So I mean, this is the Locke family sort of dynamic early on, was very competitive. You know, no quarter given, and again, without wishing to be a you know, amateur psychologist, you can see that in Tony Locke right through his career. You know, me first, everyone else last was very much the dynamic. And they were both, in a way, loners. You know, they both were self-sufficient, probably in an unfashionable sense now, very independent, you know, and didn't rely on anyone else, didn't think that anyone owed them a living, and that it was a hard world. And they were out there on their own, and they had to be on their mettle the whole time. So, you know, great men to have in your team. But, you know, Laker got a sort of reputation. And I'm not sure how fair it was. And, you know, I used to talk to Godfrey about this, but Laker's reputation sort of was that he was not a great man to rely on in a crisis, and that he might lose it. And the starting point for this seems to have been 1948. I'm jumping around a bit, Nigel, but it's important, I think, to establish Laker's sort of image, and which is why he probably only played 46 tests. He should have played twice as many. In 1948, the Aussies were set 400 plus to win at Headingley on a turning pitch. And of course, the odds were stacked heavily against them, and they did win. And Laker was not the only culprit by any means, but he was not at his finest on that final day. I don't have his figures immediately at hand, but they weren't stellar. And Godfrey himself missed an easy stumping, as he admitted. He said it was so easy I missed it because I was anticipating the bloke back in the pavilion, and I forgot the slightly important part about removing the bails first. You know, he was sort of mentally, he'd stumped the guy. I think it was Bradman even. He'd done the stumping in his mind, but he hadn't actually done it physically. So Bradman survived, and they took it too easily. In other words, the whole team, I think, took their eye off the ball. But Laker got a reputation for being not a good man in a crunch as a result of that match. And, you know, there were certain people in the committee rooms who didn't want him in the team as a result. And I think maybe unfairly, he got tarred with that image for pretty much the rest of his career. And some of that came out in his autobiography that got him in a lot of trouble. Eventually in 1960, when he retired, he was sort of settling a few old scores. But that was the sort of what he labored under, I think, throughout his entire career. And the 1956 thing was bittersweet, I'm sure, as a result, because he proved himself, and yet he never felt secure of his place in the test team, even then.
Right. Before then, of course, it wasn't until 1946 that Locke and Laker met, when they both joined Surrey at more or less the same time. How did that come about, and what was the early relationship there?
Well, it was a funny story where, you know, Laker got into the Surrey team basically because he was demobbed from the army in 46 and went to live in Catford and played some local cricket and was recommended to Surrey. So that's why he was not playing for Yorkshire, I think. Really, it was just a question of where he was living. And he did meet Tony, I think, was still 17 years old, just the youngest player to this day to represent Surrey. I could be wrong, but he's got to be one of the very youngest to play the first team. And there was a second 11 match at Bristol against Gloucestershire early on in that relationship, where Tony Locke managed to drop a catch, probably round the corner off Laker's bowling. And Laker said to the captain, he said, this again, fill in your own blank. I think there was a fairly choice word used, but this so-and-so will never be a close fielder. Stick him down on the boundary. And if ever there was a misstatement, if ever there was a bad assessment of a player, that was it. Because of course Tony turned out to be one of the greatest close fielders the game has ever known. Took an amazing number of catches. I think he's third in the list behind Grace and Hammond, is it, as catching to this day, and, you know, played many less matches than they did, and had the most incredible reflexes, and also, you know, fearless. He's the sort of bloke who would, you know, get hit on the head and then say, "What's all the fuss about?" As blood gushed freely from his ear or his eye, he'd hush away any sympathy. So Laker did not assess Locke very accurately in that first match when he said put him down on the boundary because he'll never be a close fielder. He was the opposite of that. So even then there was a bit of a misunderstanding going on between the two of them.